Welcome to Hollywood Graveyard. Today I'd turn the camera over to you, the Hollywood Graveyard community, as we travel the world to visit famous and historical graves in your neck of the woods. In this tour we move into America's heartland, the Midwest, to find legends like Jim Varney, Rosemary Clooney, Regis Philbin, Dick York, and many more. My friends, the time is yours. Our global graveyard odyssey filmed by you has brought us to the American Midwest. Today we'll be traveling through Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's roll. We'll begin today in Kentucky. This is Lexington Cemetery. If you're of my generation, you have fond memories growing up and laughing with this man, Jim Varney. Know what I mean? The comedic actor is best remembered for his character Ernest P. Worrell. Ernest was created in the 1980s for a series of humorous TV commercials in which we, the audience, were the unwitting Vern in his misadventures. The popularity of the spots led to a TV series in 1988, Hey Vern, It's Ernest.
Hey Vern, I think I finally figured out a winning act for this talent show. I'm going to turn my hand to more serious acting. That's right, Vern. Ernest P. Worrell, thespian extraordinaire. Know what I mean?
A successful film franchise would follow with 9 Ernest films, including Ernest Saves Christmas and Ernest Goes to Camp. Beyond his Ernest character, Jim is known for his voice work, including some notable Disney characters like Cookie in Atlantis: The Lost Empire and Slinky Dog in the Toy Story series. Jim left us far too soon. A chain smoker, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, passing away at the age of 50. We know what you meant, Jim, and we miss you. This is Rest Haven Memorial Cemetery in Louisville. Here we find the grave of one of Louisville's favorite sons, Marvin Hart. He was a boxer nicknamed the Louisville Plumber due to his former trade. In 1905, he defeated Jack Root to become the world heavyweight champion. He concluded his career with 39 fights, 28 wins, and 7 losses. He died the day after his 55th birthday of an enlarged liver and high blood pressure. Also here at Rest Haven is Pee Wee Reese, another sporting legend, this one in the game of baseball. He played in the major leagues as a shortstop for the Brooklyn, later LA, Dodgers from 1940 to 1958. During this time, he contributed to 7 National League championships and was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1984. Reese was also a strong supporter of Jackie Robinson and allowing him, the first black man, to play in the major leagues. Pee Wee Reese died from cancer at age 81. Next up is St. Patrick's Cemetery in Maysville. This is where we find another legendary Kentucky native, Rosemary Clooney. As a singer, she's remembered for novelty hits in the 50s like Mambo Italiano Mambo Italiano and Come On to My House.
Come on to my house, I'm gonna give you candy.
She would also bring her talents to the screen, perhaps most notably alongside Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye in the 1954 classic White Christmas. In 2001, Rosemary was diagnosed with lung cancer. She continued to perform right up until the end, passing away at age 74. Rosemary was the aunt of movie star George Clooney. Let's head up to Ohio next. Quite a few stars to find here. We begin at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, one of the more notable here in Ohio for famous occupants. Among them, John D. Rockefeller. He was a business magnate known as the wealthiest American of all time and one of the wealthiest people to ever live. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil. His wealth soared to $900 million as the importance of gasoline rose in America. At its peak, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all oil in America. By 1911, it was deemed too big for federal antitrust laws and was broken up into several entities, including ExxonMobil and Chevron. His later years were dedicated to philanthropy, supporting medicine, education, and science. Rockefeller died from arteriosclerosis at age 97. If you fancy yourself a taphophile, then you've likely seen this monument before, an icon of American cemetery art. It is known as the Angel of Death Victorious by sculptor Herman Matson, and it marks the graves of the Haserot family. The Haserots were in the business of distributing canned food and imports like coffee and pineapple, but today they are more famous for their grave monument than for what they did in life. Also here at Lakeview, we find a monument to Eliot Ness. He was a federal law officer during the Prohibition era. In the 1930s, he was tasked with bringing down gangster Al Capone. Corruption in law enforcement at the time was endemic, so Ness set out to handpick a team of agents who could not be bribed or corrupted. The men would become known as the Untouchables. Through their efforts, Capone was eventually convicted and jailed. In 1957, Ness wrote the autobiographical memoir, The Untouchables, which would serve as source material for the popular TV series of the same name. Ness was portrayed by Robert Stack in The Untouchables. Eliot Ness died from a heart attack at just 54. Years later, his ashes would be scattered in the pond here at Lakeview, this marker placed here nearby in his memory. Nearby is a grave you can't miss because there are dozens of pens sprouting up from it like weeds. This is the grave of Harvey Pekar, described as the poet laureate of Cleveland. He was an underground comic book writer, best known for his autobiographical series American Splendor. The series would inspire a film adaptation in 2003. Pekar's work would help grow appreciation for the graphic novel in America. In 2010, Harvey died from an accidental overdose of antidepressants after a cancer diagnosis. He was 70. Let's find another of the more distinctive monuments here at Lakeview. This is the grave of Alan Freed. His epitaph best describes who he was. Rock and roll was born in Cleveland when Ohio native and radio disc jockey Alan Freed coined the phrase in 1951. He championed the up-tempo rhythm and blues sound, and the music appealed to people on both sides of the racial divide. Freed ushered in a new spirit that helped break the barriers of segregation and provided a joyful soundtrack for hope and change. Through his radio and television shows, the music's popularity went global, and as such, Freed is sometimes called the father of rock and roll. Fittingly, his tombstone is made to resemble a 50s jukebox, through which youth of that era would discover this new kind of music. Freed died from uremia and cirrhosis brought on by alcoholism at the age of 43. The grandest of graves here at Lakeview is this private mausoleum, eternal home of President James Garfield. He served 9 terms in the House of Representatives before becoming the 20th President of the United States in 1881. He would only serve 6 months as president. Garfield was the second president to be assassinated, after a disgruntled office seeker shot him in a train station in Washington on July 2, 1881. The wound was not immediately fatal, and Garfield likely would have survived, but there was a lack of understanding of the importance of sterilization to prevent infections in those days. Doctors probed for the bullet with unsterilized fingers and instruments, leading to sepsis and pneumonia. Garfield died 79 days later at the age of 49. His presidency was viewed as promising, but reduced in history to what-ifs due to its brevity. One more stop here at Lakeview. Meet Ray Chapman. He was a professional baseball player who played his entire career as a shortstop for the Cleveland Indians. He holds the unfortunate distinction of being the only player to die from injuries sustained during a major league game. In 1920, Chapman was struck in the head by a pitch and died 12 hours later at just 29. His death would lead to major changes in the league, including umpires changing out dirty balls, a ban on spitballs, and the wearing of batting helmets. Our next Ohio stop is Gates Mills North Cemetery. Here lies another baseball legend, Bob Feller. He ranks among the greatest pitchers of the 20th century. He played 18 seasons in the major leagues for the Cleveland Indians, beginning in 1936 to 1956. During that era, he would throw a number of no-hitters and helped the Indians win a World Series title in 1948. 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Feller would become the first professional athlete to enlist, volunteering in the Navy. After retiring from baseball, Feller was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. He lived to be 92. The 2022 Olympics just wrapped, so let's find an Olympian here at Mayfield Cemetery. This is David Mark Berger. He was an American-Israeli weightlifter. He realized a dream after being chosen for the Israeli Olympic team for the 1972 Olympics in Munich. But on the morning of September 5th, 1972, Palestinian terrorists broke into the Olympic Village and took Berger and others hostage. 2 of the hostages fought back and were shot and killed. The remaining hostages, including Berger, were taken by helicopter to an airbase outside of Munich. But when negotiations failed and police attempted to free the hostages, a gunfight ensued, and the remaining hostages were shot, and a terrorist detonated a grenade in the helicopter in which Berger found himself. He died at the age of 28. The events would inspire the Steven Spielberg film, Munich. Here is another St. Patrick's cemetery, this one in Thompson, Ohio. Here we find the grave of Benjamin Orr. He was a musician, co-founder of the band The Cars, for which he played bass and sang. The band found considerable success in the 70s and 80s. Among their biggest hits are the songs Drive and Just What I Needed.
I guess you're just what I needed. Just what I needed.
The Cars disbanded in 1988, but Orr would continue to perform until his death from cancer at age 53. He was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with The Cars in 2018. In the early 2000s, a group of jackasses thrilled us and made us laugh with their pranks, stunts, and antics on the MTV show Jackass. One of these self-proclaimed jackasses was Ryan Dunn, who rests here at Brecksville Cemetery. As a member of the Jackass crew, he's remembered by friends and fans as a go-to for some of the more outrageous stunts. The toy cars on his grave here don't just reflect his love of cars. They are a reference to perhaps his most famous jackass stunt.
What have you been kind of dreading the most about shooting in the film? Like, what stunt were you kind of most worried about before you did it?
I put a toy car in my butt.
That's not part of you. That's something extra.
The show would make its way from the small screen to the big screen in a number of films. Ryan lived fast and tragically died young. In 2011, he was speeding in his Porsche after a night of drinking and lost control, veering off the road and striking a tree. Dunn and his passenger were killed. He was 34. This is Holy Cross Cemetery in Brook Park, where we find Patty Donahue. She was a singer, remembered as the lead singer of the 80s new wave group, The Waitresses. Their hits include Christmas Rapping and I Know What Boys Like.
I know what boys like, I know what guys want, I know what boys like.
Patty was a heavy smoker and died from lung cancer at just 40 years old. We're in Calvary Cemetery now in Cleveland, and this is the grave of Frankie Yankovic. He was an accordion player and polka musician known as America's Polka King. He had a number of chart-topping hits beginning in the 40s, and in 1986 won a Grammy Award for his album 70 Years of Hits, the first winner in the polka category. Yankovic died from heart failure at age 83. He is not related to another famous accordionist, Weird Al Yankovic. At the release of this video, we are, hopefully, at the tail end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Students of history know that most generations before us have fought their own battles against pestilence and disease. One of the more devastating of the last century came in the form of the 1918 influenza pandemic. Here at Calvary is a monument to those lost during that pandemic. At its peak, the disease had infected nearly a third of the global population, some 500 million people, and led to the deaths of an estimated 25 to 50 million people, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. We can certainly relate to what they went through, but advances in science and medicine and the development of vaccines will hopefully keep the numbers of those lost to COVID well below those of the 1918 pandemic. Our next cemetery is Evergreen in Bedford Heights. Here lies Maybelle Smith, known as Big Maybelle. She was an R&B singer who rose to popularity in the 50s. Among her biggest hits was the song Candy, referenced here on her marker, and in 1999 was honored with the Grammy Hall of Fame award.
I'm sweet on candy, and candy he's sweet on me.
Maybelle struggled with obesity and diabetes much of her adult life, and died of a diabetic coma in 1972. She was not yet 50. This is Standing Rock Cemetery in Kent, Ohio. Here's one for you 80s music fans. This is Bob Casale, sometimes known as Bob 2. He's fondly remembered as a founding member, keyboardist, and guitarist for the 80s group Devo. The group formed in the 70s and had a hit in 1980 with the song Whip It.
When a problem comes along, you must whip it. Before the cream sets out too long, you must whip it.
Bob Casale died from heart failure at age 61. He was cremated, his ashes placed into a custom 3D printed urn, shaped like Devo's Energy Dome, which was then placed in this niche. Here in Akron is Glendale Cemetery, where we find the grave of Frank Seiberling. He was an entrepreneur best known for co-founding the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in 1898. He named the company after Charles Goodyear, who pioneered the vulcanized rubber used to make tires. Seiberling played a major role in developing Akron from a small town into the rubber capital of the world. Seiberling lived to be 95. This is Calvary Cemetery in Youngstown. Here lies Pat Bilon, sometimes known as Little Pat. Standing 2 feet 10 inches, Pat was one of 2 dwarf actors to play the role of E.T. in the 1982 film E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Steven Spielberg called Pat E.T.'s biggest helper. Pat can also be seen in Under the Rainbow. He died at just 35 from a blood infection. All Souls Cemetery is in Chardon, Ohio. Let's make our way into the mausoleum. Here we find the crypt of Chef Boyardee himself, Hector Boyardee. He was born in Italy and by his teens was working as an apprentice chef. In 1914 he immigrated to New York, where he continued to work as a chef, where his Italian recipes would become much in demand, especially his spaghetti sauce. In the 20s, he began experimenting with canning and selling food products through grocery wholesale. To help American patrons correctly pronounce his name, he anglicized Boyardee to Boyardee, and thus Chef Boyardee was born, nourishing kids like me with products like canned spaghetti and meatballs. He would also produce rations for Allied troops during World War II, earning him a Gold Star. Hector Boyardee lived to be 87. Moving on to Toledo and Woodlawn Cemetery. Here lies William Harbeck. He was an early cinematographer who earned fame by filming the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. He would continue to work as a cameraman, known for his skills with outdoor locations. He was studying in Europe when he decided to sail back home to America. His unfortunate choice of steam liner was the Titanic. He reportedly filmed the Titanic before boarding and as it departed, but none of the footage survived. Harbeck died when the Titanic sank. He was 43. His body was recovered and was identified by his membership card in the Moving Pictures and Projecting Machine Operators Union. This gateway takes us into the magnificent Greenlawn Cemetery in Columbus. First among those we'll find in these historic grounds is World War I flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker. He was known as the Ace of Aces, having racked up 26 aerial victories, making him the most successful fighting ace of the war. After the war, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor, among many other citations of valor. He was also a race car driver and automotive engineer, and later in life he headed Eastern Airlines and continued to innovate air transportation. Eddie Rickenbacker died from pneumonia while visiting Switzerland at the age of 82. He was portrayed by Fred McMurray in the film Captain Eddie. Our next Greenlawn stop takes us to the grave of James Thurber. He was one of the most popular humorists of his time, his comics celebrating the frustrations and eccentricities of ordinary people. From the 30s into the 50s, Thurber contributed cartoons and writings for The New Yorker. Perhaps his most famous work is The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which twice has been adapted on film. Thurber died from complications of pneumonia at age 66. Nearby is a monument to the Thurber's cantankerous family dog, Muggs. Beware the dog. This beautiful view here belongs to Grant Mitchell. His career as an actor began on Broadway, before making supporting appearances in some of the biggest films of the 30s and 40s, including Arsenic and Old Lace, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and The Man Who Came to Dinner. Grant lived to be 82. Our last stop here at Green Lawn is Marie Earle. She didn't break into acting until her 70s, when she began playing the little old lady from Pasadena in a series of commercials. She then branched into TV on shows like Green Acres, and perhaps most notably, playing Maud Gormley in the 70s series The Waltons. Marie lived to be 95. Just down the street is the Green Lawn Abbey Mausoleum. Here in this hotel for the dead is the crypt of Howard Thurston, one of the great magicians of the 20th century. He ran away from home to join the circus, where he would develop his skills as a magician. He would become known as the King of Cards for his unparalleled skills with card tricks. Thurston was also known for performing a levitating lady illusion. At the height of his career, Thurston's traveling magic show was the largest and most popular of its kind. He died from pneumonia at age 66. We find ourselves now at Union Cemetery here in Columbus. This is the grave of Chick Harley, one of the most outstanding football players of the first half of the 20th century. His skills as a runner brought Ohio State University's football program to national attention. Fans rallied around Harley so much he inspired a fundraising drive to build the massive Ohio Stadium in 1920, still known today as the house that Harley built. Just as he was embarking on a professional career in the NFL, Harley was diagnosed with dementia, stemming from various football injuries and his time in the war. He would be hospitalized at a veterans hospital in Illinois, where he would spend the remainder of his life. He died of pneumonia at age 79. You know, sometimes I get hungry watching Hollywood Graveyard. Hershey's, Reese's, Heinz, Chef Boyardee. And how about Wendy's? We're in the mausoleum here at Union to find the crypt of Dave Thomas. He was a restaurateur and entrepreneur who in 1969 founded Wendy's Old-Fashioned Hamburgers, which would grow to become the world's third largest hamburger fast food chain. It was named after Dave's daughter. Dave Thomas became a familiar face to television audiences, appearing in most of Wendy's commercials from 1989 until his death in 2002 from cancer. Our travels take us now to Rose Hill Memorial Park in Massillon, Ohio. Here lies Paul Brown. He was a football coach and executive in the AAFC and NFL. In 1944, a new football franchise was formed in Cleveland, named the Cleveland Browns, after Paul Brown here, who was the team's first coach. Later, Brown played a role in the formation of the Cincinnati Bengals in 1967. Their stadium is named after Paul Brown. He died from complications of pneumonia at age 82. This is Sunset Hills Burial Park in Canton, and the grave of another Ohio sports star, Thurman Munson. He was a starting catcher who played 11 seasons with the New York Yankees. He was a 7-time All-Star and won the Golden Glove Award in 3 consecutive years. With the Yankees, he would win 2 World Series in '77 and '78. Munson was also something of an amateur pilot. While practicing takeoffs and landings at an Ohio airport, he crashed his plane in a landing attempt. The impact severed his spine, rendering him unable to escape the plane, which burst into flames. He died from asphyxiation at the age of 32. This is Otterbein Cemetery in Westerville, where we find the grave of Benjamin Hanby. He was a composer, pastor, and abolitionist who is famous for a number of popular 19th century songs. Best known among them are his anti-slavery ballad, Darling Nellie Gray,
Oh, my poor Nellie Gray, they have taken you away, and I'll never see my darling anymore.
and the Christmas song, Up on the Housetop.
Up on the housetop, reindeer paws, out jumps good old Santa Claus.
Hanby was just 33 when he died from tuberculosis. You know you're in Ohio with a grave like this one. This is Dublin's cemetery and the grave of Howard Cassidy, known as Hopalong Cassidy, a reference to the fictional cowboy Hopalong Cassidy. He was a football player who won the Heisman Trophy in 1955. He played professionally for 8 seasons with the Detroit Lions, with whom he won the 1957 NFL championship game. He also played with the Browns and Eagles. Cassidy lived to be 85. We're now in Springfield and Ferncliff Cemetery. Here we find the grave of the Kentucky mountain boy, Bradley Kincaid. In the 20s and 30s, he'd become one of the most popular country music performers on American radio, known for playing mountain ballads, hymns, and old-time songs like On Top of Old Smoky.
On top of Old Smoky, all covered with snow.
Kincaid was a member of the Grand Ole Opry, and in 1971 was inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame. At the age of 93, Kincaid was involved in a car accident and sustained injuries from which he never recovered. He died at age 94. Here too we find the grave of Davy Moore. He was a boxer who fought professionally in the 50s and 60s. He won the World Featherweight Championship in 1959 and defended the title 5 times. On March 25, 1963, he was fighting in a match against Sugar Ramos. Moore received several damaging blows to the head and brainstem during that fight. By the time he reached the dressing room after the fight, he fell into a coma from which he never recovered. He died from his injuries days later, at the age of 29. Bob Dylan wrote a song about his death titled "Who Killed Davy Moore?" David's Cemetery in Kettering is our next Ohio stop. Here lie Ronnie and Donnie Gallion. They hold the Guinness World Record as the longest living conjoined twins. Ronnie and Donnie were born joined at the torso. In order to provide for them, their father took them on the road as a sideshow attraction. In 1991, they retired from entertainment and lived out a fairly normal life, though they would continue to make occasional appearances on television, including in a Discovery Channel documentary. The twins died from heart failure at age 68. Also here at David's, we find Tom Aldridge. As an actor, he was well known on the Broadway stage, racking up 5 Tony nominations and winning a Drama Desk Award for Sticks and Bones. He's also known for his role as the narrator in Into the Woods. He also had memorable television roles, including on Boardwalk Empire, and perhaps most notably, as Hugh DeAngelis on The Sopranos. Tom died from lymphoma at age 83. This is Calvary Cemetery in Dayton, where we find the grave of Kathleen O'Connor. She was an actress during the silent era, with some 29 credits between 1918 and 1924. After being discovered by Tom Mix, she would become one of Western cinema's leading ladies in films like Prairie Trails and A Gunfightin' Gentleman. She can also be seen in action films like The Lion Man. Kathleen withdrew from the film world after her husband shot and killed himself in front of her and guests at a dinner party. She lived to be 62. Our journey takes us now to Woodland Cemetery in Dayton. We found a few notables here in a previous tour, including Paul Laurence Dunbar and the Wright brothers, but there's always more to discover, like the grave of Irma Bombeck. Irma was an author and humorist, remembered for her syndicated newspaper column, humorously describing suburban home life from the 60s to the 90s. She wrote an estimated 4,000 of these columns. She would go on to write a number of best-selling books, like The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank. And for television, she wrote and created a short-lived sitcom called Maggie. Irma fought kidney disease much of her adult life, as well as surviving breast cancer and a mastectomy. She received a kidney transplant in 1996, but died from complications at the age of 69. There are several points of interest marking her grave here, including this rock, which was shipped here from her home in Arizona. Oak Hill Cemetery is in Glendale, Ohio. Here we find the grave of a tragic figure in Hollywood lore, Peg Entwistle. She was a British actress whose career began on stage in the 20s in a number of Broadway productions. A young Bette Davis would see Peg perform and aspire to be an actress like her. Among her more notable performances was in the 1927 hit Tommy. By the early 30s, Peg was in Hollywood, continuing to perform on stage, but also making her only film appearance in 13 Women. But it was the height of the Great Depression, and work was scarce. Peg fell into a depression. On September 18, 1932, a hiker found a shoe and a purse below the Hollywoodland sign. In the purse was a note which read, "I am afraid, I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E." These were reported to the police, who later discovered a body in a ravine below the Hollywoodland sign. It was Peg. She had climbed the workman's ladder on the H days earlier and jumped to her death. She was 24. Any fame she sought that eluded her in life would find her in death. Her story now one of the best known in tragic Hollywood lore. Peg's story was even the inspiration for the Netflix miniseries, Hollywood. Goodbye, Ohio. Hello, Indiana. We're greeted here by the magnificent portal into Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. Taphophilia is the love of cemeteries, which I would venture applies to many of us. But what of the opposite? Taphophobia. Well, that's the fear of being buried alive. Well, if you have taphophobia, fear not, for Albert Fearnot has the answer. In response to the very real fear of being buried alive, safety coffins were devised, a popular version of which had a string attached to the hand of the buried that would ring a bell on the surface if moved. In 1882, Albert Fearnot applied for a patent for a similar safety measure, in which a string was attached to the arm of the entombed, that if moved would release a spring mechanism that would raise a flag on the surface and open an air vent. I don't see a flag or air vent here at Mr. Fearnot's grave, so we can assume he didn't meet such a terrifying fate. Let's make our way over to the crypts to find J.J. Johnson. He was a jazz trombonist, one of the earliest to embrace the new style of bebop, playing with legends like Dizzy Gillespie and Count Basie. He was also a composer, writing music for movies like Shaft and TV shows like The $6 Million Man and The New Mike Hammer. In 2001, Johnson took his own life by shooting himself. He was 77. This is the community mausoleum here at Crown Hill. Let's head inside. Here is the crypt of Bill Shirley. He was an actor and singer who performed frequently on Broadway. His Hollywood career began by often being cast as a ghost voice, which isn't as spooky as it sounds. That is, providing the singing voice for lead actors who weren't the best singers, like the singing voice of Freddie in My Fair Lady. But Bill would have his time in the spotlight as well, with the leading role in I Dream of Jeannie. And perhaps most notably, in Disney's Sleeping Beauty, he was the model and voice of Prince Philip.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream.
Bill died from lung cancer at age 68. One of the grander monuments here, the crown of Crown Hill, belongs to the Hoosier poet, James Whitcomb Riley. He's known particularly for his children's poetry. His most famous works are The Raggedy Man, which is the inspiration for the Raggedy Ann doll, and Little Orphan Annie, which served as inspiration for the comic strip of the same name, and later a Broadway musical and several films. Riley would become a national celebrity, touring the country reciting his poetry. After his death from a stroke at age 66, children began donating coins to pay for his monument. The tradition continues today here at his grave, and the coins left are donated to the Riley Hospital for Children. This is the grave of Robert Ursay. If you're a Colts fan, then you recognize the icon on his stone. Robert was a businessman who, in 1972, traded the Los Angeles Rams for the Baltimore Colts. And in 1984, he moved the Colts to Indianapolis, where they still play today. Robert developed various health problems after suffering a stroke in 1995, and passed away at age 73 just over a year later. There's also a president here at Crown Hill. Here lies Benjamin Harrison. He was the 23rd President of the United States, serving from 1889 to 1893. He won the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote. His presidency was marked by high tariffs and federal spending, which led to his growing unpopularity. but historians praise his efforts to secure federal funding for education and voting rights enforcement for African Americans, even though those efforts were not successful. Harrison also expanded the U.S. Navy, had electricity installed in the White House for the first time, and had 6 states admitted to the Union: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. He served 1 term and was beaten by the man he had beaten 4 years earlier, Grover Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison died from pneumonia at age 67. If you're a fan of Depression-era gangster lore, then you know the name John Dillinger. He was a gangster who became something of an outlaw hero to disillusioned citizens in the grip of a Great Depression. He led the Dillinger Gang, which was accused of robbing dozens of banks. Dillinger would be imprisoned several times, but managed to escape. He was able to evade police until 1934, when he took refuge in a Chicago brothel. The owner, Anna Sage, tipped authorities off to his whereabouts. The Bureau of Investigation moved to arrest Dillinger as he emerged from the Biograph Theater after watching Manhattan Melodrama. They pursued him into an adjacent alley where they shot and killed him. Dillinger was 31. After his death, his body was put on public display, viewed by thousands, and a number of death masks were made. His gravestone here at Crown Hill has been replaced several times, from treasure hunters chipping off pieces of his stone for souvenirs, as you can see here. Our next Indiana stop is Cicero Cemetery. This is where Ryan White is laid to rest. He was one of the early tragic faces of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The teenager was a hemophiliac, which required him to get blood treatments. He became infected with HIV through a contaminated blood treatment in 1984. AIDS was poorly understood at the time, and despite assurances that he was not contagious, he faced a strong backlash against returning to school. White would become a strong advocate for AIDS research and awareness, helping change public perception of the disease. He died at just 18. Shortly after his death, Congress passed a major piece of AIDS legislation, the Ryan White Care Act. Ryan's story would also inspire artists like Michael Jackson, who dedicated his song Gone Too Soon to Ryan. And a film was made about his life, The Ryan White Story, in which Ryan himself made a cameo. This is the grave of Tommy Thevenot at Springdale Cemetery in Madison. He was a Madison-born Major League Baseball player from 1924 to 1938, playing for the Cardinals, Phillies, Pirates, Reds, and Bees. He played shortstop and helped the Cardinals win a World Series in 1926. Thevenot died from a cerebral hemorrhage at age 53. Abundant Life Cemetery is in New Albany. Rosie the Riveter has become a cultural icon in America, a symbol of female industry during World War II, of women in the workforce. But was there a real Rosie? That's a subject of some debate. The term Rosie the Riveter first appeared in a 1942 song of the same name. Rose Monroe, who rests here, was a riveter at an aircraft factory in Michigan and worked to build B-24 bombers for the Air Force. As an actual Rosie the Riveter, she was chosen to be the live personification of the fictional Rosie the Riveter from the song, and would appear in promotional films and posters, becoming something of a celebrity herself. Rose lived to be 77. This charming rural cemetery is Cedar Hill Cemetery in Corydon. Here we find James Best. As an actor, he's best remembered for his role as Sheriff Coltrane in The Dukes of Hazzard in the 70s and 80s, as well as the made-for-TV movies. Other TV appearances include in the Twilight Zone episode, Jess Bell, and he made a number of film appearances as well, often westerns like Winchester 73. Best died from pneumonia at age 88. We're in Anderson now, and Anderson Memorial Park. Let's follow the sign to the grave of Ray Haroon. One can't possibly visit Indiana without making some connection to the Indy 500. Haroon was a race car driver who was also an innovative designer and builder of early race cars. On May 30th, 1911, he raced a car of his own design in what was the very first Indianapolis 500. The car was the Marmon Wasp, and he would go on to win that race, making him the first Indy 500 champion. After retiring from racing, he continued to work as an engineer. Ray Haroon lived to be 89. This is Greenlawn Memorial Park in Fort Wayne. Here we find the grave of Dottie Collins. She was a professional baseball player, a pitcher for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League in the 1940s. She spent most of her career with the Fort Wayne Daisies, where she was known as the Strikeout Queen. Dottie was also instrumental in developing an exhibition on women in baseball at the Baseball Hall of Fame. She died after suffering a stroke at age 84. The film A League of Their Own was partially inspired by Dottie's life, with Gina Davis as the character of Dottie. Let's head north to South Bend and Cedar Grove Cemetery. Here lies the legendary Regis Philbin. The submitter of this video summed it up perfectly in saying, "Everyone knows and loved Regis." So true. He was one of the most familiar faces on television beginning in the 60s, hosting talk shows and game shows. He's perhaps best remembered for co-hosting the morning talk shows Live with Regis and Kathy Lee, and later Live with Regis and Kelly.
Nice to see you. It's Monday, September 5th, 1988. Hi, Kathy Lee. How are you? And the beginning of a brand new talk show across America. And I guess you're wondering why another talk show,
We need
right?
this like a hole in the head, right?
Regis also hosted the popular game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? In 2004, Regis set a Guinness World Record for most hours on camera, over 15,000. The beloved Regis Philbin died from a heart attack at the age of 88. This is Calumet Park Cemetery in Merrillville. You may not know the name George Mulchan, but his marker here gives you a pretty good idea of who he was. He was a spokesperson for the Oscar Mayer Company, remembered for his promotional character, Little Oscar. He traveled the country for some 20 years in the Wienermobile, making appearances at parades, shopping centers, and stores. After his death at age 82, Oscar Mayer sent one of the Wienermobiles to the cemetery for his funeral, and mourners sang, "Oh, I wish I were an Oscar Mayer Wiener," in his memory. Moving on now to Chapel Lawn Cemetery in Schererville, we find the grave of Henry Homer Haynes. He was half of country music comedy duo Homer and Jethro. The pair performed together on radio and television for some 35 years, beginning in the 30s. They would record more than 50 albums and even win a Grammy for The Battle of Cucamonga. And in 2001, they were inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Haynes died of a heart attack at age 51. How about we spend some time now with our friends in Wisconsin? This is Prairie Home Cemetery in Waukesha. In these grounds is a man whose name has become synonymous with the electric guitar, Les Paul. He was a guitarist, songwriter, inventor, luthier, and recording pioneer whose numerous contributions to music have made him the only person inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Earlier in his career, he was quite a successful recording artist, selling millions of records with his wife, Mary Ford. In the 40s and 50s, Paul began experimenting with building a solid-body electric guitar, which the Gibson Guitar Company would release as the Gibson Les Paul. Today, the Les Paul is played by artists in just about every genre, but his contributions to the musical landscape didn't end there. He also innovated recording techniques with overdubbing, such as delay and phasing effects and multi-track recording. Les Paul died at the age of 94, and here on his grave, it's not flowers or stones that are left, it's guitar picks. We're in Milwaukee now, and Forest Home Cemetery. Here lies Alfred Lunt. He was an actor who appeared regularly in Broadway and West End productions in the 20s to the 60s, including classics like The Taming of the Shrew and comedies by Noel Coward. And while his focus was principally on stage work, he did make a few notable appearances on screen, winning an Emmy for The Magnificent Yankee and an Oscar nomination for his role in The Guardsman. Alfred frequently performed alongside his wife, Lynn Fontanne. In fact, they were so frequently partnered on stage and screen, they were often collectively referred to as the Lunts, one of the great acting teams of the 20th century. Lynn would be described as one of the most gifted comedic actors of the stage. And paralleling her husband, she too won an Emmy for The Magnificent Yankee and an Oscar nomination for The Guardsman. The legendary acting duo were inseparable on stage and off throughout their life, and now rest side by side here at Forest Home. Graceland Cemetery is in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. This is where Alan Ludden is laid to rest. He was an MC and game show host on television in the 60s and 70s, perhaps best remembered for hosting over 400 episodes of Password, and later Password Plus. It was on Password that he would meet his wife, Betty White. The two would go on to appear together in the comedic play Janice, as well as on episodes of The Odd Couple and The Love Boat. Alan was diagnosed with cancer in 1980, and died a year later at age 63. He was the love of Betty White's life, who would never remarry, saying, "Once you've had the best, who needs the rest?" Many assumed that after Betty White's passing at the end of 2021, she would be buried here with her beloved Alan, but to date her cremated remains are currently held by a friend. West Salem is our next Wisconsin stop, and Neshonoc Cemetery. Here lies Hamlin Garland. He was a 19th century writer whose stories featured realistic depictions of Midwestern farmers and frontier life in the 1800s. His first success was Maine Traveled Roads. He would win the Pulitzer Prize in 1922 for A Daughter of the Middle Border. Garland lived to be 79. Moving on now to Viroqua Cemetery and the grave of Nancy Parsons. She was an actress remembered for her role as Beulah Ballbricker in Porky's. She would reprise the role in Porky's too. Other memorable roles include as Ida in Motel Hell. Nancy was 58 when she died from diabetes and congestive heart failure. We find ourselves now at Oak Grove Cemetery in La Crosse. This is where Nicholas Ray is laid to rest. He's considered one of Hollywood's great directors and screenwriters, active mainly in the 50s and 60s. He's remembered for films like the noir classic In a Lonely Place and the coming-of-age drama Rebel Without a Cause. The film would be the defining role of James Dean's career and would earn Ray an Oscar nomination for Best Writing. He would be a major influence on the next generation of filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard. Nicholas Ray battled lung cancer for years, passing away at age 67. This is the grave of Howie Epstein at Second Home Cemetery in Greenfield. He was a musician who played bass on recordings with the likes of Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash, but is best remembered as the longtime bass player for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers for 2 decades, beginning in 1981. He can be heard on a number of their hits, like Learning to Fly.
Learning to fly, but I ain't got wings.
Howie was just 47 when he died from complications of drug use. Next up is Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Cudahy. Here lies John Matuzak. He began his career as a defensive lineman in the NFL, playing for teams including the Oakland Raiders. He would win 2 Super Bowls with the Raiders. After football, he turned to acting. John's most enduring and beloved role is that of Sloth in the 1980s classic, The Goonies. John was just 38 when he died from heart failure, caused by an accidental overdose of pain medication and an enlarged heart. Our final Wisconsin stop is one for you true crime and horror enthusiasts, here at Plainfield Cemetery. This is the unmarked grave of Ed Gein, serial killer, body snatcher. His crimes were so gruesome they made headlines across the nation in the 50s, with stories of skulls mounted on bedposts, and human skin used for lampshades or upholstering chairs, or even made into clothing. Sometimes the best horror comes from the worst of humanity, as was the case with the man known as the Plainfield Butcher, who spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution. Gein would partially inspire Robert Bloch's 1959 suspense novel, Psycho, which Alfred Hitchcock would later make into one of the most iconic horror films of all time. He would also inspire on-screen villains like Leatherface and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Gein's grave was once marked, but was vandalized over the years and eventually stolen, then recovered by police who placed it in storage. We'll end our tour today in the great state of Michigan. Let's begin in Detroit, which has something for fans of all things motors and Motown music. Our travels through the cemeteries of Michigan begin at Woodlawn Cemetery here in Detroit. Last time we were here, we found legends like Aretha Franklin and Rosa Parks. We're back again to find more notables in these historic grounds, like the Dodge brothers. John and Horace Dodge formed the Dodge Brothers Company in 1900, which manufactured parts for other automobile companies like Olds and Ford. Then in 1914, they began manufacturing their own cars, beginning with the Dodge Model 3035, a competitor to Ford's Model T. Dodge quickly rose to one of the top auto manufacturers in the nation. But just a few years later, both Dodge brothers were dead. John died from pneumonia at age 55, Horace from cirrhosis a few months later, at 52. Moving on, we find the private mausoleum of Arthur Ross. He was a songwriter from Motown and the brother of another legend, Diana Ross. Arthur wrote songs for acts like Michael Jackson and Marvin Gaye, including the hit I Want You. But he would meet a tragic end in 1996 at age 47. Arthur and his wife were found in the basement of a dilapidated home outside Detroit, bound and gagged. They had died from suffocation, killed in an apparent drug-related altercation. Our next Woodlawn stop is a Motown legend, David Ruffin. He was a soul singer, remembered as one of the lead singers of The Temptations in the 1960s. Perhaps the most iconic song featuring Ruffin is their 1964 hit, My Girl. Ruffin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with The Temptations in 1989. He was just 50 when he died of an accidental drug overdose. This heart-shaped grave belongs to Levi Stubbs. He was the lead singer of another legendary Motown group, the Four Tops, who had a number of hit records in the 60s and 70s, including the songs I Can't Help Myself, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, and Reach Out, I'll Be There. Stubbs is also remembered for voicing Audrey 2, the alien plant in the musical comedy Little Shop of Horrors.
Feed me, Seymour. Feed me all night long.
Stubbs died in his sleep at age 72. Let's head into the main mausoleum to find our next notable figure here. Here is the crypt of George Trendle. He was a radio and television producer, remembered for co-creating two of the most iconic heroes of radio and television, the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet. The characters made their debuts on radio in the 30s before expanding into movie serials and popular television series in the 50s and 60s. George died from a heart attack at age 87. And looks like poor George and his wife Adelaide are missing some letters and numbers here. Back out to the grounds and the Angel Garden Mausoleum, we find the crypt of Purvis Jackson. He was a founding member and the bass singer for the R&B group The Spinners, popular in the 60s and 70s. Their hits include I'll Be Around and Games People Play. Jackson continued to perform with the group until his death from cancer at age 70. There is no shortage of Motown history in these grounds. Here lies Obie Benson. He was another of the founding members of the Four Tops, singing bass in the group. He would perform with the Four Tops over 5 decades. He was also a songwriter, co-writing the Marvin Gaye hit, What's Going On. He died from cancer on the same day as Luther Vandross died. He was 69. Next we find James Jamerson. He's considered one of the first virtuosic bass players, a founding member of the Motown studio band. His style would help define the Motown sound, playing for groups like the Four Tops, the Supremes, and Stevie Wonder. As a session musician, he played on 23 Billboard Hot 100 hits, and is considered one of the most influential bass players of all time. Jamerson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000. He died from cirrhosis, heart failure, and pneumonia at just 47. Our final Woodlawn stop brings us to the grave of actress Susie Garrett. Her best-known role is that of Mrs. Johnson in the 80s series Punky Brewster. She also made appearances on The Jeffersons. Susie died from cancer in 2002. This is Northview Cemetery. Here we find the grave of actor George Peppard. His breakout role came in 1961 when he was cast to star alongside Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. He would follow this up with films like The Carpetbaggers. Then on television, he would lead the renegade commando squad, the A-Team, as Hannibal Smith. Pepard was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1992 and died from pneumonia 2 years later at the age of 65. Mount Olivet is our next Detroit stop. Earlier we visited Dottie Collins. Here we find another legend of women's baseball, Rosie Gayshock. She was a right fielder and pitcher who played between 1944 and 1954 in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Her story was also part of the inspiration for A League of Their Own. Rosie lived to be 89. Moving on now to Detroit Memorial Park Cemetery. Here we find the grave of Florence Ballard. She was a singer, a founding member of the Motown group The Supremes. She sang on 10 #1 hits with the group, including Baby Love,
Baby love, my baby love.
and Stop in the Name of Love. Ballard had a falling out with the group in 1967 and left the Supremes to pursue a solo career. She was just 32 when she died from a coronary thrombosis. Her life was part of the inspiration for the 2006 film Dreamgirls. Next up is Lincoln Memorial Park Cemetery. Here lies Paul Williams, a founding member and original lead singer of The Temptations. His baritone voice can be heard in background vocals of hits like My Girl and The Way You Do the Things You Do. He would also choreograph dances for the group. In the early 70s, Paul's ailing health began to affect his singing, and he left the group. On August 17, 1973, Paul Williams was found dead in his car. A gun was found near his body, and his death was ruled an apparent suicide. He was 34. Let's find another one for you automotive enthusiasts here at Woodmere Cemetery. This is the grave of David Buick. He was a Scottish-born inventor, known for founding, you guessed it, the Buick Motor Company in 1903. Buick began experimenting with combustion engines in the 1800s, developing the now commonly used overhead valve engine, first introduced in the 1904 Buick Model B. Buick is now a cornerstone of General Motors. David Buick died from cancer at age 74. This is Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, and this mausoleum is the eternal home of Mike Ilitch. He was an entrepreneur known for co-founding Little Caesars Pizza with his wife Marion. The first Little Caesars opened in 1959 in Garden City, Michigan. Little Caesars has since grown to be the third largest pizza chain in the US. Ilitch also owned a number of sports teams, including the Detroit Red Wings and the Detroit Tigers. He passed away in 2017 at age 87. West Lawn Cemetery is in nearby Wayne. Here is the tomb of Jackie Wilson. He was a singer, a prominent figure in the transition of rhythm and blues into soul and rock and roll. A master showman, he was dubbed Mr. Excitement. He rose to prominence as part of the group Billy Ward and his Dominoes, then went solo in 1957. He would have numerous chart-topping hits like Higher and Higher.
You know your love keep on lifting higher and higher.
In September 1975, Wilson was performing on Dick Clark's Good Old Rock and Roll Review. As he sang the words, "My heart is crying" in the song Lonely Teardrops, he suffered a heart attack and collapsed on stage. He was taken to the hospital where he slipped into a coma, suffering major brain damage from which he would never fully recover. He died in 1984 at age 49. He was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll and R&B Halls of Fame. Our journey takes us now to Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek. This is the grave of Sojourner Truth. She was an abolitionist and civil rights activist in the 19th century. She was born a slave in New York until an abolitionist family bought her freedom. Shortly thereafter, she learned that her 5-year-old son had been sold into slavery in Alabama. She sued to have her son returned and became the first black woman to go to court against a white man and win the case. Sojourner would then travel the countryside giving speeches of hope, including the famous anti-slavery speech titled "Ain't I a Woman?" She would also help recruit black soldiers for the Union Army during the Civil War, and dedicated the rest of her life to fight for a more equal society for African Americans and women. A statue of Sojourner Truth, unveiled in 2009, was the first to honor an African American woman in the U.S. Capitol building. Another one here at Oak Hill to pique your appetite. If you're like me and like to start or end your day with a bowl of cereal, then you know the name Kellogg. W.K. Kellogg and his brother John were working in a sanitarium, trying to devise healthy food alternatives. Their experiments led to the creation of flaked cereals, particularly cornflakes, in 1894. To sell the product, W.K. founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company in 1906, which then became the Kellogg Company. Today it's the biggest name in breakfast cereal, where you can still find those original cornflakes and other favorites we grew up with, like Rice Krispies, and non-cereal favorites like Eggos. Will Keith Kellogg died at age 91. On the subject of cereal, let's find another name synonymous with it, Post. Charles William Post actually sought help after a mental breakdown at the sanitarium where the Kellogg brothers were working, and met them there. This inspired him to try his own hand at cereal. In 1895, he founded Postum Cereal Company, releasing his first product, Postum, a cereal beverage. His next product, a breakfast cereal, premiered in 1897, Grape Nuts, which are neither grapes nor nuts. Plagued by chronic pain, Post took his own life at age 59. This is Leonidas Cemetery. Here we find the grave of Vern Troyer. Born with a form of dwarfism, Vern stood 2'8" as an adult. He began acting in the early 90s, making appearances in films like Jingle All the Way, and would shoot to stardom when cast as Mini-Me in the Austin Powers film series.
He is exactly like you in every way. Except 1/8 your size.
Breathtaking. I shall call him Mini-Me.
Other roles include the original Grip Hook in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. He would also be a familiar face in early 2000s reality television. Vern Troyer died from alcohol poisoning at the age of 49. How about we find another president while we're here? This is the Gerald Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids. On the grounds of the museum is the grave of Gerald Ford and his wife Betty. Gerald Ford served as the 38th President of the United States from 1974 to 1977. He succeeded the presidency when Richard Nixon resigned after the Watergate scandal. And since he had been appointed as vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned, Ford became the first unelected president in our nation's history. Ford had the unenviable task of trying to heal a nation torn by presidential scandal. Ford was admired for his honesty and respected for honorably discharging the duties of an office he did not seek. He lost the '76 election to Jimmy Carter and lived to be 93. President Ford rests here next to his wife, Betty Ford. Betty was not just a passive first lady, but set a precedent for being politically active as a presidential spouse. She was a passionate supporter of the still unpassed Equal Rights Amendment, as well as abortion rights and women's rights. She became famous for her candid discussions of hot-button issues like feminism, equal pay, and gun control. Betty also raised awareness for alcohol and substance abuse, founding the Betty Ford Center for Substance Abuse and Addiction. Like her husband, Betty lived to be 93. Evergreen Cemetery is in Muskegon. Here we find the grave of the man with the branded hand, Captain Jonathan Walker. He was an abolitionist who became a national hero in 1844 when he was tried and sentenced as a slave stealer, following his attempt to help 7 runaway slaves find freedom. His punishment for trying to help these slaves? He was branded with a hot iron by the United States government, with the markings SS on his hand for slave stealer. He was also imprisoned for 1 year in solitary confinement. He became a hero and symbol for the abolitionist movement, and would even inspire the John Greenleaf Whittier poem, the branded hand, which reads in part, "Then lift that manly right hand, bold plowman of the wave. Its branded palm shall prophesy salvation to the slave." Captain Jonathan Walker, a merchant sea captain by trade, lived to be 79. We've found some unique grave markers and epitaphs over the years, and this one ranks right up there with the best of them. This is Thetford Township Cemetery, and this grave that looks like a Pac-Man arcade game belongs to Michael Pac-Man Luther. As the story goes, Michael here was not only a lover of arcade games, but distributed coin-operated games in the 70s. He grew particularly fond of Pac-Man, so much so that it became his nickname. And when he passed away at age 55, his sister designed this stone in the style of the game he loved so much. On the screen is the iconic Pac-Man game layout, which fittingly reads, "Game over." This is Maple Grove Cemetery in Leetsville. Here lies the infamous bearded lady, Grace Gilbert. At birth, Grace was covered in very fine silky hair that thickened as she aged. As a young woman, she realized her career and marriage opportunities as a woman with a full beard were limited, so she joined the circus. She'd become one of the first and most famous bearded ladies to tour with the American circus, including Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circuses. Grace was promoted in circus sideshows as the Female Esau, Girl with the Golden Whiskers, Princess Gracie, and the Woolly Child. She also appeared regularly on Coney Island. Grace fell ill in 1924 and passed away at just 47. And finally, our travels end today at Plainfield Cemetery. Here we find an icon of classic television comedy, Dick York. He made guest appearances on some of the very early shows on television in the 50s, like Kraft Theater, Playhouse 90, and even The Twilight Zone. But audiences today will always remember him as the original Darren Stevens on Bewitched, the mortal who unknowingly marries a witch.
You don't believe me.
Okay, if you're a witch, where's your black hat and broom, and how come you're out when it isn't even Halloween?
Mother was right. You're prejudiced.
York would play Darren in 170 episodes of the beloved classic, between 1964 and 1969. While filming the movie They Came to Cordura in 1959, he suffered a permanent, debilitating back injury. He was able to keep working, but it got worse over the years and led to painkiller addiction. By the third and fourth seasons of Bewitched, he found it harder and harder to work, and the scripts began to reflect this, having Darren sitting or lying in bed or away on business trips. In the fifth season, it got so bad he wound up in the hospital and decided to leave the series to focus on recovery. Dick Sargent replaced him as Darren from season 6 on. Dick York never fully recovered. He managed just a couple more TV appearances in the 80s, but much of his later life was spent bedridden, battling his spinal injury and emphysema. He died from respiratory failure at age 63. And that concludes our tour. What are some of your favorite memories of the stars we visited today? Share them in the comments below, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more famous grave tours. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.